Hey, in this video, we're going to go over our messages row page inside of our BildrBot so that we can understand what's occurring whenever a new message is loading into our page. The first thing I want to do is just zoom into our page right here. It feels a little bit blank in the studio. All we can see is our copy clipboard and our trash can, but there's a few things going on here on the page. If we just look at a quick tour of the page, we have our whole messages div. We have a little image here for a profile picture that doesn't have any default value. We have our markdown display, which is our text input. This is where we actually put the content. And then we have our action icons. By default, we have our copy and our trash can that shows up on every single message. And there's a thumbs up and thumbs down that we can show based off some logic. So there's a few things that we do on this page whenever it loads up, and I want to show you and walk through this along with a third-party library that we use. So like every single page in Bildr, page load is the first thing that happens whenever the page pops up. With our messages page, there could be 30, 40, 50 messages that pop up in a moment. And so if that were to happen, like if I opened a current conversation, it would occur. Or whenever I add a new message to an existing page, it also just runs page load for that particular message. And so let's go into our page load and then we run page binding. So the first action that we actually run is our data run bindings. Bindings, as we've talked about in a few different areas, is a specific function that looks at the page and says, have we bound any data to specific elements on this page? And if we have, let's go run the process that it takes to do that correctly. And so in this case, we've data bound from the messages collection, the message field, into this specific element right here, the markdown display. What's occurring on a higher level here, if we recall from the last video, if you watched it, our conversation page has a repeating list of our messages. And to that repeating list, we set our current conversation into the page and go get every message in our collection that is associated with the current conversation that we have. What our repeating list is ultimately doing, it's unraveling a big set of JSON, which is given to it via data bindings. It unravels that JSON and creates a row for every single one. It creates one page. And especially with our message row page here, it feels like rows. It's the same as rows in an Excel spreadsheet, in a database. It's really the same as looking at our data collections in our messages tab. If I were to filter it by, let's say, let's grab this ID right here, messages. So here's two messages that come with this conversation ID. Hello, how can I assist you? And hey there. So this is my user message, and this is the assistant message that gets back. And I can really look at every single row page I have as just one of these rows, and a variable exists, and I can refer to the values of the current record. This is a record, and I can view this as the current record on a page for my message rows when I filtered the repeating list by the conversation ID that appears here. That's an important idea too. The way that the Bildr collection relationship field type works is the value of the field itself is actually the ID of this collection. We are just going to look up and display the name associated with the ID that lives inside of this field. And so that's why we see this instead of just a string of an ID. If I were to actually change the field type to text, let's say, it might take a refresh. Let me X out and hit messages again. Paste in that value. And now we can see the conversation ID field is just referring to the actual ID that I had there. So I do want to switch it back because I prefer looking at that. Especially, it's really useful when you're building relationships in your database and you just want to make sure things are correlated correctly. So that's what's occurring in our repeating lists. We're just taking all the records from that database and making a page to represent each record. And so if we go into our messages row page, under our page binding, I'm just saying the current messages record that got set into it, I want you to put it right here. That's the message I want. So that's step one. The next thing we do on page load we go to page binding. We do an if-then logic check. We actually do two eventually. The first one is we want to display the page to make it look appropriate depending on the author of that message. And in this case, we've stored that in the type or role field from the OpenAI action. We automatically set the appropriate assistant or user, or if we did a custom setup, we could do a system prompt message as well. In this case, we still store the system prompt on the conversation ID collection instead. So we do this if-then logic check where we look at this specific field on the current record field value. It's really important that we know that we're able to just target the collection and the field in this case, because we're using the current record field value and Bildr knows we've set a current record into this page. It's not just any random message. It's the specific one that we put into this page. And so if that value is equal to user, I set the state for user message. If the value is anything else, I set state as the AI chat message because I know this is a binomial scenario. It's one or the other. There's not additional options. I could use, if there were additional options, we have a if-then multiple logic check, which can compare an individual value against any number of potential values. And so this is a value to check for multiple values. In our case, we could at some point introduce a system message into our messages collection if we chose to design this a little bit differently. And I could check for a user, system, or assistant message, and I could trigger a specific flow based off of that match. Again, I'm not doing that right now. I just wanted to talk through a use case in where you might not just check one value, you might check multiple. If it's a user message, the only thing I do is I set that image that's right here, that's invisible right now because there's no values there. I set it to this specific image available at this URL. And this is our little green person that pops up right here. It's just that image that we load in. The other route is I set state AI chat message. And in this case, I do a couple more things. First, I set the background of the div of our whole message container. I change it to a slightly darker color. Next, I show our thumbs up and our thumbs down icons. So if I go to my elements, I can see these thumbs up and this thumbs down. So I show a couple different things for me to interact with. Other than these messages, these don't actually do anything right now, but I could certainly integrate that in a couple different ways and do various, I could create records of liked messages. I could tell the AI, hey, like next time I send a system prompt, I could tell them this wasn't a good message. I could do all sorts of things. And so I show those two options. And then I also, if it was the AI message, I set the Bildr logo as the author image. So that's what happens when we set the state for an AI chat message. Now, one thing that might feel a little bit strange if you're not familiar is the process of inheritance to influence this row page right here. So by default on this page, I haven't set any styling on the actual page itself. So that's why there's no background color. That's why the text doesn't have a specific color associated with it, because there's no styling assigned to this page. What that means is when this page loads somewhere else, it's going to take and inherit the stylings of that page, which is why when we jump over to our conversation page and we see I've loaded this message row into our conversation page right here, it's instantly taking the styles of this page right here. And I could show this too if we wanted. I could just go ahead and add the page body class. And so now it'll take the style of our body class immediately, and I can see the message row right here. I could do the same for our conversation row page. Actually, I could do it the same for our message row page and it wouldn't matter or change the outcome at all because it's just going to inherit the normal background that was already there. And it gets overridden anyways if it's an AI assistant to make it darker. The one thing that I wouldn't want to do on the name row page, and why I wouldn't want to do that, is if I do page body, it has this dark background here, or rather this kind of the gray background. However, as we can tell over here, I now would have little lines on these because I actually have a darker background for my menu. And so I don't want to do that definitely on the conversation page. I could certainly come up with its own body style or class. But one reason that we like to keep body classes open-ended is because we may end up styling this page and using it in multiple pages. And oftentimes, in some of those circumstances, I would like my page to always inherit the style of its parent. I don't want to re-influence its design. And so I can keep it as open-ended blank canvas as possible here, so that when I reuse it, it looks and behaves exactly like I expect it to. And so that's why these are all clear. Now let's go back to our message page and go back to page load and page binding. So I've done that process of I set the state for the user or the AI. The next thing I do is I run a custom JavaScript function just called triggerPrettify. And this is where I want to get a little bit deeper. And I very specifically brought this into this template. One, because I personally use AI for code all the time. And I find it really valuable to communicate in code and ask questions. So, hey, can you give me examples of JSON, CSS, HTML, JavaScript, and Python? And so Bildr's a no-code first platform at heart. We believe that the way that the next generation of content and things will be created and applications will be created is with no-code tools. It's going to be heavily AI enabled. We are certainly involved in building around AI. That's one of the reasons that we're building this template, is to make it easier for you to use AI. But I also believe that using code in the process of no-code solutions and against AI is the ultimate unlock tool, because you can access extra things the better and better that you get at referencing code when you need it, in like the 2 or 3% of the time that you do, using no-code visual tools when you need it, and then also pairing in and bringing in AI to assist with that build process and to assist with problem solving especially, is the true unlock for people when it comes to development. And it's an incredibly powerful thing. And so it's the reason that I'm doing this, and it's how I use the AI tool a lot, and why I wanted to bring the library in, because I wanted to show you what it's like we built all of this. Essentially, we've not used code in one thing that you've seen in this template. And this is one example of how I could integrate a third-party library. So a whole set of code that exists on the web, someone else made something that did all of this, and I'm able to reference it in 2 distinct ways. So that's what I'm doing right here. I trigger Prettify, and this is something that I've clarified what this should do in the header of the website. So if I go to my page headers and I open this up, I'm going to see right here, code block response Google Prettify library. I'm going to open that. Now, the first thing that you see in this is a script that pulls in this URL right here. This is the library. This is called a CDN file. It's like basically a global URL to go get a file of JavaScript. And that file of JavaScript gives me the functions and the actual JavaScript code that runs when I ask it to do certain things. And so that's the first thing that happens in this. The rest of this was just basically written by ChatGPT over time. And so I won't go through like line by line what's occurring. When you get this project, just copy this and paste it into ChatGPT or BildrBot and say, hey, what does this do? And it'll tell you exactly what it's actually doing. Essentially, the quick version is, the first thing I do is I define this function prettyprint.json. And this is doing a process of unraveling JSON. JSON being whenever we have a key and value right here. I want to unravel this so that I can see these two side by side. And from there, the next thing that I do is actually all of this is actually this process right here to format JSON properly, pretty print JSON. That's defining that one function right there. That's what that means. Function, pretty print, and it just defines it. It actually doesn't even run it in this case. Next, I am defining the next function called add pretty print. Inside of add pretty print, I do a series of things. And then one of those things is if the language identified as JSON, run the pretty print JSON function. So it doesn't do that every time. It just looks to see if the value is JSON. And the reason it's specifically doing this is I asked it to color our key value pairs a very specific way for JSON purposes. And that's why it looks a little bit different. And so that's what's occurring right here is it runs that right there if there's JSON there. The first part of this function is actually going ahead and looking at the information I got back from OpenAI and looking for if it's a pre-element, I want you to do this stuff. And the first thing is I want to add this pretty print class to it. And this is a way that the code can target everything on the page that has this pretty print class to do a specific thing. And so let me show you actually what occurred here. If I explore this a little bit, I can see I've got this pre-class. Pre is basically this like external block that typically houses code blocks. So I see this code block right here, and then each one of these little things inside of it, as we scroll down, are spans and divs that have specific values inside of that code block. This outward black container is a pre-element, and then inside of it is a code block. And that code block can be identified as a specific language, or it could just be identified as code generally and not specified. And so that's what's occurring here for us is we're clarifying, we're looking at this code and saying this is code. And then the reason I did this is because I wanted to use this for code. And so I can copy it directly here instead of having to copy it there, or instead of having to try and highlight it correctly inside of this. So the next parts of this are basically creating a wrapper. So it puts the whole thing inside of another container. It creates a header that is existing right here. Inside of that header, I put this little copy button. So create a copy button, add a click event to the copy button. So copy button.add event listener, click, and then do all of these things. And this is where one of the reasons I really wanted to bring it up is because of the ability to connect Bildr to code dynamically, very, very easily, especially as you use Bildr a little bit more, you build as well as use AI. What's occurring here, if you recall, if you saw the very first video in this series, on page load of our home page, so our home page, the very first thing that we run is this set copy code flow as a variable for the Google Prettify library. And basically in creating this variable copy action message flow, this is the name of the variable and it's on the root page. I could say current page and it would behave the same way. I just like to say root page whenever I know I'm targeting that page. I'm giving it a value of target this flow that runs do it on this specific page. And let me go ahead and console log what this shows for you. And this is something that you're not going to do 99.9% of the time. I just wanted to show for someone who is a developer that likes seeing kind of the power unlock of Bildr, this is a really good example of opening up Bildr and why it's such an open and flexible platform. So I'm going to console log this value just so that you can see this. So I'm going to go ahead and reload our page here. And go to console. And right here, you recall I set these consoles in the last video, so that was just another example I was giving. But this is the variable that we just set. Page dot, it uses a ID for the page, and then dot, it uses an ID for the specific flow that we targeted. So if I jump back into Bildr, just to show you this, if I go to this page right here, I can see my ID pops up right here. That's that first value, BY4. And then if I look at my flow, new message copied code flow, new message copied code flow, I can see the ID right there, G8T, G8T. And so what I've done is I've given myself a variable value that I can reference that is the exact flow that I want to run so that I can run that flow at a specific point in time. And now if I go back to my page headers, my library here, everything else here is literally just copy and paste stuff from OpenAI. The first thing reference I have is boppy.helper.get page variable. And what I do here is I say on the root page, get the variable value copy action message flow. That's all this does. It just goes and gets that variable. It's a way to get it in code instead of get variable in my actions. And as long as it's been set, I can refer to it this way. In this function, what this does in JavaScript is just sets that variable value into this other variable value that can be used inside of this function. So this is another variable that I can reference inside of this very easily, and just a more common structure. The rest of this is just doing normal processes of setting how this should interact and how it should select and copy the content it's intended to copy. But then at the very end of this, I run another boppy code row, which is just boppy.helper.run page action from request. And what I do is I put the variable value that I set here. So set on page load, I set this locally just for this little set of code here. And then I am targeting this specific action with this boppy.helper code. And so I've gone kind of full circle so that when I copy something, and I want to reuse that message center. So if I go back to the message that I used with, where I requested the code, which is somewhere in here, there we go. And I can click on my copy button. This button was rendered by that code, and I can copy that. So it runs that whole process right there whenever I click the button. And then eventually all of this is reduced to, here's a function called triggerPrettify that I can call at any moment, and it's going to run the addPrettyPrint, and we know the addPrettyPrint includes my top JSON function. And so it goes and does all of the code I need it to, so that I can, if there's any new pre-blocks and code blocks on the page, I can go ahead and format it so it looks like code instead of looking like plain normal text, which is what it would look like if I didn't do that. It would just look like any regular normal text on the page. And so that's what I'm doing by styling it this way and giving us a really cool, nice format for looking at our content and looking at these code blocks that we have here. One thing I'd love to show you too is just to dive deep into why this works is because OpenAI sends data specifically in what's called the Markdown format. And so can you send me another set of code for me to change a button to red? I don't know what that's going to do. That might work. It's going to say something, but normally I'd be a lot more specific if I was asking for something. But it's going to give us an attempt. It's probably just going to be some simple JavaScript to target a specific button and say something like, hey, like here's how you choose a button. Here we go. So we've got the code of the HTML to just say, here's my button. And then we've got the CSS it gave us to style my button with the background color of red. And it gave us filled in some of the blanks with other ways that we could maybe want to make a button look. So when we hover, it goes dark red, all that kind of stuff. So in our response that we got back from OpenAI, the reason that the Markdown element knows to create these pre-divs and code blocks is because in the response, we get this kind of unique format right here, this /n HTML. This is basically telling our Markdown element, hey, this is supposed to be a pre-div, and inside of it is an HTML object that looks like this. And what I do then whenever we load the page, so that was the response that we got back from OpenAI. That's the response that exists inside of our database. And when we load up every single message page, we trigger that Prettify function, which was in our header that contained all of the code in one function that just says, hey, do this. And then it goes and runs it and it formats it so it looks the way that we want it to look, like code as we intended. So that's one example of how to integrate a third-party library. That's how you can call custom JavaScript if you needed to right here. You could certainly write a full function right here if you wanted to as well. And it is also how you can then integrate some of the no-code flows into that JavaScript function to, again, do whatever it is that you can really imagine inside of Bildr. So after we do that, we do this final if-then logic check on the page load of our messages row. And this is an important concept for understanding the process of creating a record in a repeating list, creating a page, and the concept of an array index. An array index is simply where in the repeating list element is this? What number slot does it sit in? The most important concept to know this is that the repeating list always starts with 0 as the first number. And so if I X this out and I open up a new conversation, there's going to be a request call right here for messages associated with the conversation ID I just sent it. Let's look at the preview of the response and go to our object here. And I can see my object is an array of 2 objects. So this hard bracket means introduce array. This little bracket means this is one object inside of this array. When it closes, it goes to the next open one, and it's the second object. And so I can see 2 objects and I can see 2 values. But the key part is the first one's labeled 0. That is because 0 is always the start. It's always the first number of something in almost all of code. And typically, anytime you reference the first value in an array, it is called 0, meaning that the second one is 1, and so on and so forth. So Bildr automatically, on every single row that exists in a page, so all of my message pages, when it gets created, it has a variable called array index. In fact, I can actually show you this. We have an action in Bildr called get page variables. Let me go ahead and temporarily set that. Get page variables. I'm going to get the page variables for the current page. I'm going to set the response into a variable, all page variables. And then I'm going to console log it as well. And I'm going to console log that variable. So set current page, all page variables. Rather, set the variable current page there from the current page. So let's go ahead and refresh. Actually, what should happen, if I just clear console log out, if I select a new conversation, you can see I just set 4 messages loaded. So we can see 1, 2, 3, 4. We can see 4 different console logs of all the variables that exist on each one of these individual pages. And inside of this, what you're going to see is there's going to be a specific variable called underscore array index, and the value is going to be where it sits inside that array. So the top one is 0, hey there. So we can see the value, where's the message? Somewhere in there. Oh, the value is right at the end here. Hey there is the value of the message. And then we have value hello, how can I assist you today? Right there as well. And the array index is 1, so that's right there. And so on and so forth as we go down the line. So what I want to do though is create a situation when I load up a new page, I want to scroll to the bottom message automatically. I don't want to start at the top of a giant thread and have to scroll forever to get to that message. Especially over time, threads can get fairly long, like something like this. And I don't want that to be the case every time. And so what I'm doing, let me delete these out, is I'm doing an if-then check to say, I'm going to take the variable array index, and I can identify that by, if I open a bracket inside a math function. So if I have this other advanced input called math that lets me do any sort of calculation I want. I can use variables and elements to calculate, subtract, add, any sort of math to be able to get functions. If you're doing like a cart checkout, you could oftentimes add variables this way. If you are wanting to do a simple calculator, you would use something like this frequently to manipulate numbers to get the values that you need. And so the reference value with opening a bracket is how you would do that. And so in this case, on the page load, I'm taking the current array index. This math function will always refer to any variables on this page. So you can't refer to a variable on, let's say, the parent page from math on this page. You would have to do that in a different method to go get the value there. There's certainly a way to get it, but you would just have to probably first set the variable locally from it before you use the math, or vice versa, run a flow on the parent page. And so in this case, I'm taking my array index, I'm adding 1 to it. And that overcomes that fact that there are always the number that's the highest array index will always look like one less than the numbers that we're used to looking at, because it is starting with 0 instead of 1. So this array index value is 5 right here. And so this is the 6th one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So we can see all 6 of those messages right there. So by taking the array index and adding 1, I'm checking it against the length of the repeating list on the conversation page. And so I'm basically just looking at my messages repeating list, and I look at the length of it. What is the length of it? Length will always return. So if we ever use this path in anything, what it returns is the length of that item. And then in the case of an array, it's going to tell you how many items are in it. And this is a JSON array of objects technically. So how many objects are in this repeating list? How many pages are actually here? If I were to do this of just a text string of numbers, it would give me the number of characters inside that line of text. And so I'm checking, is the array index plus 1 equal to the length of the repeating list? And if it is, I want you to scroll to this current page. And scroll to current page is a very simple built-in action. It just says scroll to page. And we scroll to the div, the outermost div inside this page. So that will force the page to scroll as close to that div as it can. So in this case, it was able to scroll right to the top of it with all this value above it. If it was a smaller threaded conversation, it won't scroll at all because there's nowhere for it to scroll. But it will behave the way that we want it to by scrolling as best it can to make sure that the most recent message is displayed, which again is the expectation for a message history or conversation of any kind. So that's why we wanted to give the messages row page its own video, because there's a lot going on. There's some unique things with our custom JavaScript function. There's some unique logic with styling, and there's some really unique logic with the array index variables, using the math function, using the length function, that I wanted to make sure we had a video dedicated to fully explore and understand. So that's that video. In the next one, we'll go ahead and talk about our prompts row page a little bit more and how it's used in both of these environments on 2 different pages, and how we make sure it is behaving differently but appropriately for each of those different pages.